Hi guys, so today's video is going to be a list of some adult fantasy and one adult science fiction book that I think are really great for people who are just getting into adult fantasy and sci-fi or are typically YA readers and are wanting to read a little bit more from the adult age range. One quick little heads up, I am perfectly comfortable recommending books even if I didn't personally care for them. So you will see a couple on this list that if you've watched my channel, you've probably heard me say that I wasn't the biggest fan. It's purely because I know books are subjective. Just because something won't necessarily work for me doesn't mean it won't work for you. And that is true of the first recommendation, and that would be Foundryside by Robert Jackson Bennett. If you've heard about Foundryside, you likely have heard about its magic system, and that's a big staple often in adult fantasy. It's what draws a lot of people to adult fantasy is the magic systems, how well realized they are, and I think this one is a perfect example of that. And the magic system is really cool. I think it was one of the highlights of the book. The way it works is you have objects that can be scribed to believe that their reality is different and therefore function against essentially the laws of physics. Even though the magic system is rather complex, I think in its concept, it's rather simplistic, it's easy to grasp, but the author does dive into it quite a bit, so there's a lot to explore with that. And the characters and the dialogue, I think, are what make this book quite approachable. The tone overall is very youthful. Next up, we have a book that I'm a huge fan of. Not only do you see this on a lot of beginner fantasy book recommendations, but you also see it often used as an example of where to start with the Cosmere, and that would be Warbreaker by Sanderson. I know a lot of people also recommend Mistborn. Mistborn is a trilogy, and it definitely is quite approachable, but Warbreaker is currently a standalone. You can read it on its own. If it never gets a sequel, you'll be fine. But this one I think is just a tad more approachable than Mistborn. It has a slightly more lighthearted feel to it. Mistborn is very doom and gloom, so it's a little bit of a bummer. Two main characters are these two sisters, one who is supposed to be wed to this other kingdom. Her kingdom does not like these people, but it's to fulfill a marriage alliance. And then her other sister has never had a care in the world because she has no political obligations, and the father, he favors the other one way more, so he sends the clueless one in the other sister's place, and then the other sister's like, I'll have to go rescue my clueless sister. And the way they think about each other, just them in general, they're so likable, but also neither of them know what the heck they're doing. And so you often are getting information as they're getting information. The magic system in this is also quite complex, but I think really fascinating. It's one of my favorites. There's also a lot of political intrigue, more I would say court intrigue, and I loved that element of this book. There's also another character who is basically a god, except for he doesn't believe in gods. He's very humorous, so he adds a lot of the lightheartedness to this book, but there's still a lot of high stakes, there's a lot of mystery, and I think that even though it's pretty chunky, it definitely makes you want to turn the page. Next up, we have Traitor's Blade by Sebastian de Castell. This is often compared to the Three Musketeers. It does definitely have a good guys, bad guys feel to it. You follow our main character, Falcio, and his two pals, and they were formerly individuals who served the king's law. So they were loyal to the law, not necessarily to the king himself. And you learn that the king, he was killed, and a lot of society felt very negatively towards his guards because they served the law, not the king. So they didn't really do much to protect the king. But you see this moral conundrum in the character. They're coming to terms with this, but they also are so loyal to a cause, and that is what makes them the good guys you can root for. They absolutely believe that there is a good, that they have to do what's right by the people, by the law. And so that's what they're going to do while also going up against some slimy politicians. This book, I think, just has a very fun vibe to it. There's a lot of action scenes, so if you're a big fan of action and you like books that are faster paced, you're gonna get a lot with this one. Next up, we have Jade City by Fonda Lee. If you are new to fantasy in general, but you like a lot of crime related books, this is the book for you. It is basically like urban fantasy. It doesn't take place in our own world, but it's heavily inspired by our own world. It feels very much like it's taking place in our world with just some name changes to places, and we follow a gang family. They're known as the No Peak clan, and you see this clan going up against their rivals, but it's very much about the little moves that they make against each other. It's not like they're constantly out causing a bunch of violence or things like that. It's a little bit more subtle and quiet and intricate than that. Also, if you like family dynamics, character examinations, familial drama, you get all of that and then some with this book. It does have a magic system, but that magic system is a little bit easier than a lot of other adult fantasy, as it's more almost like a drug, but that drug gives you abilities that regular drugs wouldn't give you. Next two books that I'm going to recommend, their general setup actually sounds quite similar, so I'm going to mention them both at the same time and then talk about what makes one different than the other, and that would be Red Rising by Pierce Brown. This is the science fiction book on the list, and then we have Rage of Dragons by Evan Winter. Both of these books have a caste system with a main character who is one, somewhat trying to get revenge. The revenge elements of Rage of Dragons are much stronger, but both of these individuals are trying to break the caste system down. I would say that element of the story is much more pertinent to our main character in Red Rising. That character is a little bit more so living for more than just himself, where in Rage of Dragons, the character, it's personal, it's what they are wanting. They want to take down the enemy, and if they break down the caste system in the process, that's a bonus. Rage of Dragons has quite a long training sequence, and if you're somebody who loves that, if you like seeing the grind, then you're gonna really appreciate that about Rage of Dragons. This one, it's more about the infiltration, I would say, to try and bring the caste system down. So this one, I would say, is a little bit quieter in its execution, whereas Rage of Dragons is a little bit more in your face. What's funny is that despite the fact that these two both sound somewhat similar, they tend to not attract the same readers. People who love Red Rising tend to not love Rage of Dragons as much, and then vice versa. And that actually is true for me as well. I liked Red Rising so much more than Rage of Dragons, but both, if you like revenge stories, if you like people trying to totally throw a wrench in the current system because the current system is unfair, it oppresses a lot of people, then you're probably going to want to check out both of these. Both are incredibly easy to get into. This one, often people miscategorize as YA, despite the fact that it can be kind of violent and have some pretty mature themes. And then Rage of Dragons, it's not considered YA. I've never seen anyone consider it YA, but I would say that the prose is much more elegant in Red Rising, whereas in Rage of Dragons, it's much more direct. I also would add that Red Rising, I feel, has stronger side characters and stronger female characters because the Rage of Dragons setup is so personal to our main character, Tao. I think that it's much more about him and his struggle, and I would say you get a little bit less of the side characters than you do in Red Rising. So one is going to be a lot more of, you're going to feel it in your gut if you feel for the character. If you don't, you're probably not going to necessarily like it as much. The next book would be Sword of Kaigen by M.L. Wong. This is a dual point of view story primarily, and we follow a mother and her teenage son, which is already a very different setup than you usually get. It is Japanese inspired, but it's quite different from our world. The land that our main characters live on, Kaigen, is very traditional, and the rest of the world is very advanced. And there's a lot of kind of brainwashing. The government really instills in its people a certain line of thinking. They can't question anything. There's a lot of propaganda present, and it's really interesting to see how that affects the characters. When you're first getting into the book, the first 150, 200 pages are a little on the nose. They're very exposition heavy, but that's part of what makes it very approachable. If you're a little bit nervous about adult fantasy, this one, it holds your hand a little bit in the beginning, makes it very clear this is the setup, this is why the society is the way it is, and then you get into some really heavy themes, you get into some really emotional moments. The motherhood element of the story is phenomenal. The effects of war is done so incredibly well. So there's a lot to love about this book, and what might be considered a weakness to some people with that beginning is going to be perfect for people that are just getting into adult fantasy. Last on the list would be The Queen of Blood. This is the first book in the Queens of Renthia trilogy, all of which are very approachable. They're all very short and similar to Red Rising at times. This is miscategorized as young adult. I don't know if it's because it's shorter or because the writing style is quite direct and I would say a little bit simplistic, but either way, it's adult fantasy and it has this amazing forest setting. It's very unique in that the forest, it functions due to these spirits that come in all different shapes and forms and are very all tied together by the fact that they want to slaughter humans because humans kind of harm the forest. To keep the spirits from slaughtering everybody, the humans have a woman who is the strongest magic user who holds them in check. That's about it when it comes to the magic system, so it's not too complex in that regard, but you do find that in the first book, you're going to cover a pretty large period of time, and you're going to follow two main characters, one of which is very tied to the magic, and then the other one is tied more to the world. So those two individuals, you're really going to get to see everything. You're going to get it very organically, and I really enjoyed it, and it being so short is such a plus because it's pretty hard to find an adult fantasy series where every single book is on the shorter side. I'm going to be doing a couple other videos related to this. We're going to have one that's the direct opposite, where it's young adult books that I think a lot of adult fantasy readers could enjoy, as well as some of the advanced fantasy books, so be on the lookout for those. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day. Definitely let me know what books you would recommend for getting into adult fantasy, and I'll see you guys later. Bye.